Hello. Today we're going to be taking a look at the V-Ray plugin for SketchUp. V-Ray is a rendering engine which allows you to take your SketchUp models and create photorealistic imagery using things like special lights and materials built into the V-Ray plugin. So let's have a look at what we're dealing with. Okay, so after we've installed V-Ray, usually the four toolbars that come with V-Ray Next open up automatically. If they don't, and you want to have them in your scene, you just click up here on View and Tool Palettes and make sure that everything with the word V-Ray next to it is selected. Okay, I'm currently looking at this through a Mac computer, but the setup for V-Ray in Windows is exactly the same. So nothing that you're going to be seeing will look any differently than it would on a PC. Okay, so I'm just going to drag some of these toolbars up out of the way so that they're not in the middle of our window, and I'm just going to talk about some of the elements that are visible here. Okay, two of these toolbars we're not really going to be dealing with today. This last one, which is to do with mapping of materials onto objects, so we can close that one for now. This one is dealing with special V-Ray geometry, things like an infinite plane for establishing a ground surface, especially useful for exterior renderings, as well as things like V-Ray fur, which allows you to create objects with fibers on them, things like carpeting or hair on someone's head or grass on the ground, something along those lines. And the clipping plane, which allows us to do sort of section renderings without actually having to put a section in our model, as well as proxy objects. Okay, so we're not going to get into that today, so I'm going to close that one as well. But the two that are left we will be talking about. So we have the main toolbar here, which is our V-Ray asset editor, and everything that's to do with rendering is set up in there. And if we wanted to start a rendering right now, we can click on this teapot, or we can click on this teapot, or if I have the frame buffer window open, I can click on this teapot. Basically anywhere there's a teapot is usually a sign that it will start a rendering. Okay, the teapot next to this teapot with the hand on it is for a special type of rendering, which is called an interactive rendering. And what that does is it starts a render window, the frame buffer window, and it will constantly update and re-render whenever you make any kind of change to your scene, whether you zoom in or rotate or put in a new material or add a light or anything like that. Whenever you have that turned on, that instantly updates, and I'll demonstrate that in a second. Okay, the other aspects of our toolbar, we're not really going to worry about these ones. These are special render windows. This is the frame buffer window, which is the same button as here. This is to do with cloud rendering. Again, we're not going to be getting into any of those. As for the next toolbar, these are our lights. So we can add lights into our scene, and they come in different shapes and parameters. So the first one is a rectangle light, and as the name suggests, it's a light based on a simple rectangle. So sometimes we use this for fill lighting, or if we want to have a type of lighting in our scene, like a fluorescent light fixture in a ceiling, where basically we just see a rectangular light shining into the room. That might be a place where we can use this type of light. The next one is a sphere light. This is very useful for whenever we want to see the light source, like a light bulb. It radiates light in all directions as a sphere would. So if we have a situation where we want to have literally a light bulb inside of a fixture or something along those lines, this might be a good place to use that. And depending on the size of it, the bigger it is, the brighter it is. The next type of light is a spotlight, and we could use this in situations like um, pot lights in a ceiling, or a spotlight in a theater, or something along those lines, something that's got a more of a directed light with a sort of a conical output. So that would be a good um, place to use spotlights. This one is called an IES light, which is a specific type of light that's associated with a manufacturer's particular light fixture. And these are um, special files that you need to download, usually from lighting manufacturers, and put them into the software. So we won't be getting into that in our introductory course. So that's a little bit too advanced. But feel free to experiment with it, or Google how to use that down the road when you might be getting a little bit more comfortable in V-Ray. The next one, OmniLight, it's very similar to a sphere light, except it radiates light from a central point, but it's not visible in our scene. We can always make the sphere light invisible, so in a way there's certain aspects of these two types of light which are very similar. Um, the next type of light is called a dome light, and this is particularly useful um, for when we want to have a exterior, um, basically a dome of a view around our model. Um, it's not quite used as often in an interior rendering, but it can be incorporated in such that if we're looking out a window, that view outside would show up almost like a real um, exterior would look, as well as it produces light from the image. So if there is a light source like the sun, or some kind of light fixture or something that emits light in the image, that image will actually illuminate your model. Okay, so it uses what are called HDR images, which is a high dynamic range image, and we will get into that when we're um, looking more in depth at lights. Okay, and the last type is what's called a mesh light, and what this does is it allows us to take any object in our scene that's a group or a component and turn it into a light. So if I were to, let me close this window for a sec. For example, this cup here, if I wanted to have an illuminated cup that's, looks like it's part of the table, but as a kind of interesting design feature, I could turn that into a mesh light and it would produce light. So again, we will get into that in greater detail when we start talking about lights. Okay, so getting into the asset editor, there's a few points that I wanted to show in here. Across the top are different elements of our scene. So if we want to add materials or edit materials in our scene, we need to click on this button. Currently, I only have a generic gray material applied to everything in the scene, but this would literally list all of the materials in your scene just like it does in SketchUp. So every SketchUp material that you're using will also show up in here, and you can highlight one here and it'll be highlighted in SketchUp and so on. Okay. Um, the light bulb here shows us all of the lights in our scene. So when we start adding spotlights and rectangle lights and things of that nature, they will all be listed here, where all of the parameters for that particular item are shown here for fine-tuning or adjustment. And a lot of these things we don't need to know too much about, but certain aspects of lights or materials, depending on what it is. Um, you can see if I reduce this over here, let me make that picture a little smaller. We can get into like the color, change the color, and so on and so forth. Um, we can add reflections or refractions, like if it's glass or something like that. Opacity, depending on if it's see-through, if it's got a texture to it, like bumps or things of that nature. So we can make all of those adjustments over here. Okay, so yeah, these are our important icons up here in order for us to find out things in our scene. We can also hold down the Shift key and select individual ones to all see at the same time if we don't have too complex of a scene. That way we can kind of see everything in one glance. Obviously, the more materials and objects and lights and things that we start adding into our model will make this a lot more complex, and we'll have to like scroll through a lot. But just by having, this element open like this, we can control a lot of what's going on as far as the V-Ray aspects of our model go. Okay. On the gear icon, these are our settings, as I mentioned, for our renderings. I'm going to demonstrate quickly what the interactive rendering actually looks like. So if I click on this little teapot with the hand on it, I'll get a frame buffer window that opens up. And whenever I make any change to my view or to my model, it instantly starts to update in the render window. So if I were to zoom in, you can see that it starts to re-render. If I were to rotate around, same thing. It will start to update the scene here. Now, again, depending on the strength of your computer, you may or may not want to leave this running in the background. Personally, I don't have a particularly strong computer, but it's not that bad either. But I normally don't leave this running just because it's you're spending too much time looking at the pretty picture over here instead of getting your work done. So I normally don't have interactive turned on. Now, the difference between progressive and non-progressive renderings, if I were to reset my view to where it was a minute ago, you'll notice that this window doesn't update because I've turned off the interactive rendering. So if I want to see what's going on, I just hit the teapot and it will re-render the view as it is. Okay. Now with the progressive setup, it keeps sort of refining it, making it smoother and smoother based on the setting of the quality that I have here. If I were to stop this rendering and turn this down to draft and then hit render, it'll finish much faster, but it'll look a lot rougher. And sometimes that's enough for us to just see, how bright it is or how dark the scene is or things like that. So the draft setting can often get us as far as we need to go quickly without needing to see a highly refined rendering. Now with this progressive set to medium, if I were to also turn on the denoise or denoise, whichever way you want to say that, if I were to render it, what it does is it gets rid of all these little specks and smooths things out nicely for a really quick but still good looking rendering. Now obviously I don't have any materials or lights in this scene other than the sun, but you'll see that as it puts the denoise filter on things, the surfaces become a lot smoother. So it's denoising right now, and when it's finished, it should look quite a bit different. We'll just give it a second here just to see how it does. Okay, so as you can see, it's really smoothed out those aspects. So if I go back to just my RGB before the denoising, you can see all the little dots in there. So this is the end result, and you can see that can do a pretty good job. So depending on what kind of materials or things like that in your scene, sometimes this is enough to get you a pretty good idea of what your scene looks like. Okay. Now, if we turn off progressive and open up this little sidebar here, we have a lot more of our parameters that we can adjust depending on the settings as well. So one place that I usually turn my attention to first when I'm starting to do my renderings is under global illumination. We have our primary rays and our secondary rays. I always change brute force to irradiance map simply because it's faster. It's not quite as perfect or as accurate as brute force, but for our purposes, visually, you're not going to see much of a difference. But in the amount of time it can take for a complex model, the irradiance map is a far better solution. Okay, so That's one thing that I always set up right away. We don't get into too many of the other settings. Um, when I get into the later on video about um, final renders and setups like that, uh, we'll go into a lot more of the parameters of the irradiance map and the light cache and so on and so forth, about how to limit the noise to give us this kind of effect without, you know, fakery, which is what the denoise filter does. So, but again, for our purposes, leaving things on irradiance map and draft, and with the denoise turned on, we can quickly get some pretty decent results. Okay, so that's the basics of the asset editor window. Okay, so that's all I want to talk about today, and we will get into a lot more detail in future videos when we start breaking down the lights and the materials and render settings. So I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks.